For more on the situation regarding COVID in Sydney, I'm joined live by epidemiologist Professor Michael Toole. Professor, thanks for joining us today. Firstly, we've seen 7 new cases in Sydney, only 1 not linked. They're pretty low numbers but persistent. How satisfied are you that this outbreak is contained?
Well, as you said, they continue to be low, but they're persistent. And I think the fact that there are continuing new cases and that some of those cases have been acquired outside of the northern beaches is still of concern. In Victoria, when we were in the lockdown, modellers predicted that restrictions could not be eased until what we call the rolling 14-day average of new cases was less than 5. So currently it's 9 in Sydney. So I think it's certainly not time to ease restrictions, and I would consider some new restrictions, particularly on New Year's Eve.
The Premier did say that she's hoping to announce those plans tomorrow, potentially the next day at the latest. What do you think they should look like? Because of the current restrictions we've got, there's everyone has stay-at-home orders, obviously, for the northern beaches, with some outside gatherings allowed.
Yes, I think the concern is not the northern beaches at the moment. People seem to be compliant. There's very high numbers of testing. I think it's in the Greater Sydney area. We know that some cases were infected at a pub in Erskineville, a pub at Circular Quay, a workplace in the CBD, and a cafe in Paddington. So that's a good spread across Greater Sydney. So we only need one of those persons' contacts to, say, attend a pub with 300 people there indoors shouting, and then, as you know, at midnight singing Auld Lang Syne and hugging and kissing. I think that could potentially be another super spreader event. So whatever can be done to avoid that, I think should be done. And certainly, I don't know what the forecast is like for New Year's Eve, but people should be celebrating outdoors. It's almost always indoors that people get infected. The other thing I would add is I think it's over time to mandate masks in settings where you can't physically distance. So first of all, public transport, and then, of course, shopping centres and other indoor venues. And I saw the images yesterday of people at suburban shopping centres in large crowds and very few wearing masks. So I think rather than saying, please wear a mask, I think it's time to say you must wear a mask.
And I will get a bit more on that in a moment, but just back to New Year's Eve. In terms of the gatherings that can be allowed at public venues indoors, what would you like to see? What form of limit would you like to see?
I think the current 10 for Greater Sydney should remain. And for the northern beaches, 5 or 10, it probably depends on the number of cases in the next day. I certainly wouldn't go over 10. Victoria may...
What about at hospitality venues?
Oh, look, I would go down to 50. I mean, that's sort of off the top of my head. 300 just seems too much. You know, we know how people behave on New Year's Eve, me included. So we just don't want to take that risk. You know, I think a lot of those venues can put on outdoor events in their beer garden. And I think that's would be my preference. I think another thing to consider if this 14-day average doesn't continue to go down is to really extend the stay-at-home restrictions in the northern beaches to Greater Sydney. Just do it for a short, sharp time, just as Adelaide did it, and they contained their outbreak very quickly. Victoria, on the other hand, acted very slowly back in June. And I think from those two lessons, different lessons, New South Wales, I think, should err on the side of the Adelaide response and really have a short, sharp, what we call stage 3 restrictions. Stay at home except for 4 reasons.
So rather than, say, lifting restrictions partly for New Year's Eve, you'd rather see all of Greater Sydney plunged into lockdown?
I wouldn't use the word lockdown. I think, as I said, I'd still allow gatherings of
stay-at-home orders, rather?
Yeah, stay at home. You know, certainly not a curfew or any of the other things that Melbourne did when we got out of control. But I think it's really worth considering stricter restrictions over New Year. I think it's going to be a short, sharp pain for the hospitality venues, but it may allow them to open up in the new year COVID-free.
And Professor, given the way that we have seen states react to the New South Wales outbreak, other states and territories just been with borders shut, would you say it's now fair to say that Australia is definitely pursuing elimination over suppression, regardless of whether states or territories themselves want to?
Well, whether or not they outrightly said they were aiming for elimination, 7 states and territories have achieved elimination. The last one was South Australia, which has now gone 28 days without a local case. So now we've achieved it through a lot of sacrifice, particularly in Melbourne. I think we should continue to commit to that, provide all our support to New South Wales to achieve that. But I think to achieve that in New South Wales will probably require extra measures. And as the two I've said, masks, number one, because they're easy, they don't disrupt the economy, they're affordable, we're all used to wearing them in Melbourne now, even though it was hard at first. And the other was considering a stay-at-home order. Just going back to masks, my institute, the Burnet, did a study on the impact of masks in Melbourne. And we found that when masks were recommended but not mandated, about 43% of people were regularly wearing masks. When they were mandated, that went up to 99%. And people fear enforcement. It was introduced in Melbourne without any kind of punitive attitude by the police. Victoria Police data show that of all the fines issued during the lockdown, only 8% were for not wearing a mask. And of that 8%, more than a half were people in well-organised anti-mask demonstrations. So the police were more likely to give you a mask than a fine. So I don't think Sydney should be nervous about becoming a police state because you have to wear a mask.
Professor Michael Toole, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure.